Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you all today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the test and also my methods for teaching students about the test. One of the difficulties of preparing for the AP US History test is knowing what's important, what to cover and what not to cover. How much do you need to know about this subject and that subject, and so on and so on. There's a lot to cover, and you only have so much time to do it, so it's important to know what's important and what's not. There are practically an infinite number of facts and details and years and dates and times that a student could memorize in order to prepare for the test, but of course, there is only a finite amount of time for a student to be able to prepare. So in order to remedy that situation, I've organized the topics for discussion into a general overview of events in American history. Depending on the amount of time that a student is able to study, i.e., depending on how long they have before they take the test, it would determine how long that we spend on each period. I've broken U.S. history into a few particular eras, such as, to begin with, it starts pre-colonial, then the colonial era, the Revolutionary era, then the time after the Revolution, and so on and so on. And depending on the number of lessons that are available, we would cover, say, like one class would be spent studying just the pre-colonial period. Along with these period overviews, we also talk about specific themes that are central to understanding what it means to be American in general and what the quote-unquote American story is about. These topics have to do with race and quote-unquote freedom and expansion and so on. And these themes are compared to each other, and they're compared within different time periods. We see how these narratives come together, especially for the purpose of answering the long essay and document-based questions, which is often shortened to, the document-based question is often shortened to DBQ. The individual facts and the individual names of, say, legislation or Supreme Court cases or what individual presidents did, there isn't any limit of how much it's useful to know those things, because you never know exactly what the multiple choice questions are going to be about or what a document might be about, but there is a limit to how useful it is to spend your time learning about those things. Because in order to answer the document-based questions well, you need to have mastery over the themes and the relationships between time periods much more than you need to know individual details. So, for example, say that a long essay question is based on the effects of Reconstruction in the post-Civil War South. You could learn multiple different ways in which the South passed legislation that was against African Americans at that time. But really, when it comes to making comparisons or talking about themes in the post-Reconstruction South, if you can talk about, for example, the black codes that were passed by the legislatures following the changes in politics in the United States at that time, if you can talk about just one example, that's all you really need to meet certain criteria within the essay. Along with learning how to make historical comparisons between time periods, so going along with the Reconstruction theme, learning how to make comparisons between today's Black Lives Matter movement, the Civil Rights movement of the 1960s, the Reconstruction period, and the Civil War, and knowing how these things fit together and being able to come up with ideas about how they fit together, that's how you make a good essay, whether it be the long essay question or the document-based question. Along with being able to tie those themes together, you would also need to be able to actually compose an essay well. So along with the information, the basic information of American history, you also need to know how to have a strong thesis, how to relate topics to that thesis, and I have extensive experience with essay writing, not just with AP US History, but with SAT and ACT, and all of them together combine to make a significant portion of how students will improve their essay writing ability when they study with my course. Along with the structured study of details about individual time periods and the study of how to write an essay properly and the study of how to compare time periods to one another, another important thing to learn about are the institutions of American history. So how does the U.S. Constitution work? What are important Supreme Court cases, and how do they tie into those larger themes of American history? All of those things together make up that narrative of American history, and knowing what, say, democracy is or how democracy compares to republicanism, those are larger philosophical questions that aren't necessarily a part of the stories that they talk about, but are very important to know. So along those lines, we will have discussions about, well, what is, say, the federal government versus the state government? What do states' rights versus federal rights mean? Why did slavery come to the United States in the first place? There will be some connection to things like European history and general world history that will have to be understood in order to understand what has happened in American history. So all those things together will be combined to look at larger philosophical questions about what it means to have a civilization and to have history in the first place. Now, with those general policies and those general tactics in place, each student's curriculum will be tailored to their individual strengths and weaknesses. In the first class, we will discuss, or before the first class, if it's possible, we'll discuss where the student feels they're strong, where they feel they're weak. If the student has a lot of experience with essay and they feel very confident with essay and they don't need help with the essay, we're not going to spend time doing that. If we have multiple students in a class, we'll strike a balance between what everybody's strong with and weak with. Every curriculum will be tailored specifically to where students need the most help. It's often the case where I have students who have already taken some AP US history classes and perhaps they feel very strong in the World War II era and they don't need to spend time with that, but they have almost no knowledge of what happened in the antebellum war period, just as an example. So then if we don't need to talk about World War II, we'll focus our attention to the areas where they need the most help. And we'll pick out themes also in the periods where they do feel comfortable to ensure that they have the comprehension that they need to do well on the test. So with that general overview and with that discussion of what's expected on the test and what would be done with essays, I'd like to open the floor to questions. I'd like to see what questions people have and address those one at a time as best as I can.
现在讲到一个片段，Neal老师想看一下大家有没有什么问题，学生啊、家长啊，对这种 AP 美国历史有没有什么问题，可以就具体的问题再做一下详细的解释。
The textbook I like to use is The American Pageant. It's freely available online so the students and I can coordinate. It's extremely well written. It's highly detailed. It's recommended by AP US History. I know some students they find it a little bit difficult when they have it in class, but I've found that when it's addressed with a certain amount of openness and talking about major themes rather than focusing on minute details, it's not as difficult as it may appear. There are a few books that I like about world history that I find can really help a student out understanding U.S. history, especially for younger students. The Cartoon History of the Universe, which starts very, very early, but you can pick up some of the later ones that start closer to the American history period that are extremely energetic and extremely helpful for younger students. There's also an illustrated version of the People's History of the United States, by, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but it's a very famous book. Zwick, not Zwick. I'll look it up real quick, but it's a People's History of the United States, and there's an illustrated version that's really good. Howard Zinn, that's the name of the author. The original text is a little difficult, but the illustrated version with the comic books, it's really quite good. Other than the general overview comic book ones that I like for younger students, almost any kind of literary fiction that ties into a particular time period is very helpful. There are just countless young adult novels that are set in these time periods that can help humanize these issues and help students focus on the ones. But if I'm going to start students off on anything and learning about the dry stuff, it's going to be the comic book versions of it, because I've seen kids just light up about things that they didn't light up about before when they read those. As far as the things that students need to look out for on the long essay and the DBQ, along with having a strong thesis and connecting their ideas to the thesis, there are a few different skills that the essay makers look out for. You need to be able to contextualize, and you need to be able to involve ideas from outside of whatever text or whatever moment that they're thinking about. So when I teach these students, I also teach them about things like economic theory or other things related to other fields that can be applied to theory. Economic theory, in talking about capitalism and communism and things like that, is a really good one to go for. Talking about industrialization and like I said, economics is one that I really like a lot, but you could talk about psychology, other things like that. And so once you know about that, you can talk about Adam Smith's invisible hand of the marketplace, and you can tie that into talk about Jefferson's ideas on the noble farmer and states' rights versus federal rights. And if you do something like that, talk about the free market and attach that to, for example, Thomas Jefferson's ideas about the ideal society, then you would be doing what you need to do. You could also talk about Plato, talking about the Republic. You can bring in those concepts and tie them to other texts like that, and you would be accomplishing the synthesis side of things. In addition to the synthesis-based thinking and bringing in those outside ideas, talking about the broader scope of American history and talking about the themes that go through it, like pointing out the relationship between the Civil War and Jim Crow laws and the Civil Rights Movement and, say, Black Lives Matter, for example. We talk about how those ideas tie together, and doing cause and effect, talking about how one thing leads to another. That's another thing that you need to do on the long essay and on the document-based questions, is be able to draw those larger pictures, not just this was the immediate cause and this was the immediate effect. You need to be able to go outside of the immediate range of the question. It really depends on what your situation is. Are you going to take the test in your junior year? Then you want to start in your sophomore year. Are you going to take the test in your senior year? Then you could start your junior year. But honestly, it doesn't matter what age you are. You should start learning these things as soon as possible. I would say that's true of any AP subject. The sooner you start picking up the basics, picking up the details, the better you're going to do. It's not impossible to get started and kind of cram in a short period of time, but you really do want to have a long time to kind of mull and think about it and really understand what's important about the subject, not just what's important about the test. Because if you don't understand what's important about the subject to your own real world, then you're not going to understand the topics that it's bringing up, the larger themes. That is probably the most difficult question that there is to answer, because everybody has different ways of memorizing these things, and it's difficult to say how important it is as well. Because as I've mentioned before, there's an infinite amount of detail that you can learn that could be helpful. But it is only helpful so far as time devoted to these things is concerned. So knowing the names of particular things is important, but dates are far less important. The most important thing is timeline, knowing what happened before what and what relates to what as far as causality. So knowing that Henry Clay was an active politician before the Civil War is more important than knowing when Henry Clay ran for president, like by year. And hands down, the best way that I've learned to teach and learn history is to think in terms of narrative rather than in terms of dates. So if you know story structure, you know that you meet the hero and then the hero goes and finds the dragon and then the dragon is destroyed. So when you're talking about history, it's not good for being a historian, but it is good for being a student of history, is to find out, all right, so we're talking about racism, for example. What's the story of racism? Who are the heroes that slayed racism, and how did they slay racism? Setting up these narratives is very important. If you just give like a list of presidents and say this president did this, and this president did this, and this is when they did it, there is no meaning and no help whatsoever to students. So in order to achieve comprehension of what exactly makes history interesting and what makes history vital, why do we need to learn about, say, the antebellum South? Well, the pre-war South is important for understanding modern America. If you don't understand the pre-war South, you don't know why a million things are happening. So for memorizing people, turn them into characters. For memorizing dates, turn them into cause and effect. Establishing context establishes memory. Take it out of the dry history books and connect it to the way that the world that we live in today and what is actually vital and interesting to people. I know that history can seem dry, but one way I describe it is that history is just the longest running television show that is possible, and we're in season like 2017. We're in season 2017 of a very long-running TV show. And if you want to understand what all the characters are doing and why the characters are doing what they're doing, you got to go back to the beginning. You got to catch up on what the most interesting episodes were that you missed before. So history does not have to be boring if you know why it's interesting. And as soon as you open up a kid to what really makes history vital and interesting, then it's like a house of cards. The whole thing comes down. Suddenly, everything about history is interesting once you make one thing about history interesting. That's been my experience anyway. The United States is a country that is founded on immigration, since unless the person has a Native American heritage, they came from somewhere else. So while whites have been dominant since the English colonization, the history of the United States is of people from all over the world coming to the United States and trying to do something. One of the great tragedies of American history is that the early success of the United States was built on labor that was not paid for. But to put it mildly, it was not paid for. So to understand racism is to understand a lot of the reason why the United States is the way that it is, why certain legislation happens, why certain events happen, why people are angry, why people are not angry. Understanding America means understanding racism. It is just, you cannot understand the United States without understanding why some people are happy and some people are sad. And one of the reasons why that is because of injustice and social inertia, and it's just really hard to overstate how important race relations and the attempts to deal with the just scarring effects of slavery are. And so you have to start really there. Ethnic identity and commerce and expansion, those are all parts of understanding the United States. For short answer, you need to it's not, a short answer question is not that different from a long answer question, except that you don't need to do as much work with larger themes. So for short answer, you just need to answer the question. So having a really clear thesis and having a really clear supporting detail for that thesis should be enough to get you to where you want to go. So you need to do thesis and an explanation, detail that supports that, and then analysis of why that's the case. Truthfully, the short answer questions are not that different from a multiple choice question. You just need to know what the answer is, with some explanation of why the answer is the answer. It's just they don't give you the multiple choice questions to choose from. It should be very straightforward with a very clear thesis and support for that. Conflict of standards, that's why you should use AP history approved textbooks, like the American Pageant, because if you don't, then, so for example, if you used something like the People's History of the United States, which is a wonderful textbook, it's not even a textbook, I mean, it's a wonderful book that has accurate views of history. If you start writing about something that's not in one of the AP approved textbooks, then you are going to run into that conflict. The only way to avoid that potentiality where someone says, well, they're kind of wrong, is to stay within the bounds of the materials that are outlined by AP. I suppose it could influence how the student perceives the topic in the first place, but the student shouldn't involve that aspect of their personality when they're writing about it. There shouldn't really be even a first-person perspective. When you're writing the essay, it should be done from the third person, from as neutral a position as possible. These essays are not graded on the sparkling like intelligence of the perspective, like, oh, it's such a unique way of looking at it, it's such a clever way of taking this topic and connecting it. There's no like ranking of like, if you hit a certain level of success in your essay, then you are just as good as everybody else who did that well at that essay. You can only do so well and no further. So all you really need to do is meet the points of the rubric. There's no purpose served by trying to come up with an interesting personal narrative or trying to come up with a flashy, interesting, clever intro. You want to have something that shows that you understand what you're talking about and the subject at large, and you want to keep it more than like basic, but really you just need to do what they ask you to do and keep your level of language to the point where it's not elementary. So better than basic is all you really need to accomplish as far as the rubric is concerned. You still need to have a high level of understanding of the way all the topics come together and things like that. You don't need basic understanding there, but the writing level doesn't need to be flowery or personalized, no. AP US History, AP Euro, and World History are not that different from each other. It's still going to require the same amount of effort. It's going to be the same kind of topics. I mean, not the same exact kind of topics, but history is history. Humans are humans. The story is the story. You're just looking at a different part of the story. If you feel stronger in AP Euro, if you feel stronger in European history than U.S. history, then go for it. One thing I will say for U.S. history over European is that U.S. history is shorter. We've only got a couple of 100 years, and it can be a little bit easier to cover it, but the transfer is with AP Euro, you're looking at a broader time frame. With AP US History, you're looking at a shorter time frame, and so you have finer details in the AP US History than you do in the European history. It's just you have less to cover in US. I have time management skills that I teach to students. One good thing about these AP tests is that generally time management isn't a massive issue, but there are some general test-taking skills and time management skills that I teach. If a student struggles with good multiple choice analysis, like how to do process of elimination well and how to know when they've done process of elimination well, then that we'll talk about that. I do give help with how to do process of elimination and how to manage time properly if a student is struggling with